Take responsibility for our shit. Stop scapegoating them.
Yeah,
taking responsibility starts with acknowledging what the fuck is actually happening on the ground and dealing with the reality of it rather than scapegoating or deferring to pander or secure any kind of resource from any fucking body. No, starts with what's really happening to people. And you can't just sell this one narrative about the deficient black male and the victimized black woman and refuse to acknowledge any of the data or the historical scenarios that actually point out black male vulnerability. Because again, it's not just about women. It's sanctioned women. It's state sanctioned women that have resources from policy and institutional support that they can use at their behest that you as a black male do not have. That's what we're talking about here. He's trying to present it like you got a bunch of dudes that are just pissed off at women and then telling you they're weak. Well, with that scenario, I would say so too, but that's not what the fuck this is. She got a battery in her back and several generations of brainwashing, basically. The hatred, the contempt for men is being passed down. And many a black male in here can tell you they saw it happen in their own families. They watched it be passed down. They watched the women they grew up with, who grew up and became women, pass the same hatred to the men they dealt with that they saw their mothers teach them to have. There are events that take place in the public that reveal to black men how we're seen and how we're actually treated. You know, another one, for example, is the death of Kevin Samuels. Now, this isn't about whether or not you liked or agreed with Kevin. It's not about that. Because there were brothers that diehard did not agree with anything Kevin Samuels said, but when they saw the level of contempt for Kevin, where these women were literally throwing parties and dancing on his grave, you had brothers that were like, oh, it's like that, right? And I've said this before, we can look at feminists over the last few decades that malign black men in incredible ways, and you did not see black men throwing parties to celebrate their deaths. You didn't. This was a one-way dynamic, and just the level of negativity, the level of bile coming out at black men in different contexts. This is what I'm referring to as the black masculinist turn, where men see this and really get a kind of a red pill smacked to the face about how they're actually seen, even in their own families. You have some families, some men that have heard this their whole lives, but it took a certain moment into their adulthood to finally hear. Even the women in their own families negate their very existence. And it takes until that moment for them to say, holy shit. Here we go.
Man, we got to be patient with our women because we created that personality.
We got to be patient. First of all, we've been patient. Black men have been the most patient group. Kevin, I remember Kevin used to tell stories about it being in the workplace and other racial groups of men would approach him and ask him in as respectful a way as possible, how do you tolerate your women's treatment of you? I've had private conversations with Kevin as well, where he talked about that very thing, right? Where other groups of men didn't understand how we could tolerate it. And we got generations. Matter of fact, for black men, tolerating this shit is a language we've grown up speaking, because you learn even as a toddler that your well-being depends on her moods. So you learn how to interpret, how to adapt, how to seduce women that really hate your guts. Learning how to talk to people that don't see you as a viable human being is something we grew up doing. We watched women that hated, and I'm not talking about all of us, of course, but many of us grew up watching women that hated you because you look like your father, but you learned how to talk to her to get what you needed, how to soothe her, how to make her feel good. And that translated to going out into the world and talking to women that sometimes had a low opinion of you for things you couldn't even control. I grew up in the 80s, man. The whole dark skin thing for men was real. I remember it. And I saw women that would outright tear you apart in public if you tried to seduce them or talk to them or get their number simply on the basis of how dark you were or how much money they perceived you to have or not have. And yet I saw men move around those things and walk away with her number or walk away with her on a date or whatever. We learned how to interpret and move past these kind of barriers because we all grew up with them, or many of us did. Right? The problem we have most particularly in the Black community in the West, is that we have a bit of a conundrum happening in our community, right? We're in one vein, starting with Generation X being the first generation to primarily be raised in single parent households more than any other that led up to that. We were conditioned to serve Black women, right? So that you got that on one end, where mothers raised you to be the men that they didn't have, right? So you have that dynamic. And yet at the same time, you had to navigate this kind of contempt they had for us while dealing with the systemic barriers that sought to undermine you. I mean, even Umar brought up the prison industrial complex in the 1970s. That's not a fabrication, that's real. So you had to navigate all of that at the same time while being socially conditioned to serve someone who's been developing a platform of misandry for years. And yet we still navigated it. We still dealt with it. So this whole question of what, us being responsible for her poor choices is absolutely bullshit. And the second part of that frustrates me when I hear these kind of random statements that people make is they completely underestimate how the entitlement affected the very idea of a viable man. Look, how many of y'all grandfathers would be considered viable men by women of today's standard, right? Now, I ran across this on a couple of different pages. I had several people send it to me. I can't say if this is accurate or not in terms of a person who actually wrote this, but I can say that I've seen it for decades. I've heard it for decades. I've had classes where I've had women in the class list their desires in men on the board, and it exceeded this. So before you come at me and tell me this isn't real, which I had people on Facebook do when I posted, let's be real. Shout out to Watch Me Do Better. Appreciate that support. Right? But these are the kinds of lists that we see. And this list is short compared to some of them that I've seen over the years. But if you can't see it, it says single mom looking for a stepdad for my kids. Qualifications: must have six-figure salary, must have a car that can fit all my kids comfortably, or willing to buy an SUV or a van. I actually experienced this. This is the shit that I saw birthed in the 1980s. It wasn't always like this. If it was always like this, that would be one thing. I saw this come up in the 80s. I remember it. I was a male in a family full of females. I heard many a war council. And I didn't understand a lot of it, but I listened and I remembered. And so when we started to have these conversations among men, I started to understand the things that I had been hearing for years. What percentage of Black men actually produce children? It's a relatively small percentage that do. They don't want to have to deal with men who have demands, men who expect reciprocity in some way, shape, or form. So what they do is they find men that are easily controlled. And a couple of years ago, I had a neighbor of mine who went through a really bad divorce, at a certain point, and ended up being pushed out of his family house. We had a conversation, and he said, "Look, man," he said, "I'm only asking you this because I just don't know who to ask." He said, "I've noticed my wife she's a newly six-figure earner. She's an administrator, and her and her girlfriends are all white collar. They're all doing fairly well." She said most of them married ex-cons who were either sleeping on their parents' couch or they were couch surfing. Most of them are in and out unemployed. She said they actually married those men and they knew what those men's conditions were before they married. And now they come over to our house regularly to drink wine and complain about how trifling their husbands are. And they complain about how they have to give those men an allowance. But here's the thing. He said, one, I don't understand why they keep doing this, because each one of them dated men at their level at some point in time. And they chose men that they knew they could control. He said they would brag to each other about starting arguments, knowing full well he couldn't do anything. If he left there, he had nowhere to go. So he was talking about white collar, middle class Black women who actually sought out men that they can control. And they would have 2 and 3 kids. They would get married, but had no respect for these men from day one. Now, sometimes with some of them, they talked about how much they enjoyed the sex, but that wasn't even one of the focal points of the discussion. It was incidental. The focal point for him and my response to him was control. See, she could produce a family on her terms. She can make decisions about households and purchasing houses and selling houses and taking this job versus that one with no significant pushback, because at the end of the day, if he pushed back too hard, he'd have to go. And he'd have to pay child support. That was the interesting thing. Even though she would make more, these cats would get divorced and end up still paying child support on kids that they no longer could see. But nobody wants to talk about how much control these women sought to have with men that they knew they could, they could run circles around. It wasn't a matter of this is all that was available, because those women had actually dated men at their level. They couldn't control men at their level or beyond, for that matter. But like I said, even the average working woman won't always want to even deal with the man that's just average working and right next to her at the, the Amazon factory where you work, right? Technically, according to the statistics, he makes a few thousand more, but he's still not good enough. Right? And keep in mind, as long as the primary group that's reproducing with these women, not only is it small, but they're men that are primarily able to be controlled more often than not, it's going to continue to devolve.
His own kids too, but he's going to make time for you. She got masculine because she had to become masculine in order to deal with the rape, the abuse, the domestic violence, the disappointments that men had in her life, and also raising those kids and having to take care of herself all at the same time. The black woman has been the be all in all in our community for half of a century, and now we want to turn around and say because she didn't do it perfectly enough or remain feminine enough when she had to absorb our responsibilities.
Has nothing to do with whether or not she did it perfectly or not enough. Not what we're talking about. We're talking about the way institutions and policies have been used to undermine black men and to frame family and buffer class status at their expense. See, by framing it in this simplistic way, it's easy for even a 5-year-old to say, wow, yeah, black men are horrible. They're trifling. He's right. It's very easy. Easy to consume, easy to digest. Reality isn't always easy. Matter of fact, most of the time it isn't.
You're selecting a poor mate. And what I'm saying is they don't have much to select one. If a woman disrespects me,
there we go.
Right? That still don't give me a right to disrespect her.
See, and this is part of what we've been trained with as well. This is part of why there's a gynocracy. It is expected that part of your defined manhood as a black man is to take disrespect. And how well you take it, how stoic you can be, how deferential you can be, how willing to forgive and forget her you can be, all of that defines your manhood. If you don't accept it, there's something wrong with you. But the problem is that narrative is starting to break down because more and more men are deciding that it's not worth it. And that if you want to continue, if you want black men to continue to participate in the community, you have to offer them something more than this silent, sacrificial, fall on your sword and be chivalrous bullshit.